Hi, everybody. Welcome back. So one of the things that we that we like to do is to just sort of connect around large themes, right? That the specificity of what you discussed obviously isn't the point, but there's something positive and important about our sharing back into our larger circle. The the lessons that we're taking from or the things that we're learning from one another, and to sort of crowdsource that in a larger space, even though we do that in our affinity spaces. So I'll ask our facilitators, and I know we doubled up, so perhaps the burden is less, but for you all to chime in certainly as things come up. What were some of the overarching ideals or themes that you um, experienced or heard coming out of your groups that felt like they resonated? And I guess, thinking about the one bit of direction, I try not to give too much direction because I like people to feel free. And you should still feel free. But, thinking about this in the context of being 8 months into this thing, I think that is a particular type of framing that might be helpful for us to sort of think about like where we are hearing folks are, what their experiences are. So Tomas, Robin, Nadia, Rachel, Molly, what were you hearing that sort of might give us a sense of where folks are at?
I'll go ahead.
Okay.
We had a really good conversation. We talked a lot of different things.
I'm very sure, Nadia.
Yeah, we talked about a lot of things. But what came up, one of the things that, in terms of what you were saying around the 8 months, is like what has really changed?
Mm-hmm.
What has really changed
Mm-hmm.
in terms of the uprising and understanding that there is this conversation around anti-racism and wanting to give back to Black communities, but in the grand scheme of things have not changed in terms of representation in workspaces, in terms of how we're supporting people, in terms of the expectations of what we're supposed to do, still having to work 10 times harder. And then because we also talked about just the perception of what it's like to be a Black woman in these spaces. And when you say no, how that can be perceived when you're trying to just engage in self-preservation and in self-care.
Mm-hmm. A thought that comes to mind when you say that, and I wonder how this sits with others, and is around the various statements that came out immediately when folks started to figure out that might be a right thing to do, to write a company or an institutional or organizational statement. And, the pushback some had around, okay, what are these statements? But also what has changed or what are we doing as a function of those statements? And so Nadia, I feel like your group was sort of tapping into the material reality of our work, or the conditions and the context around our relationships with our colleagues or our relationships to our work, that has not shifted. And so the question then is, and what will we do with that, right? Or what can we do with that? Or what are we demanding or needing of our organizations and institutions to do with that?
And Misha also brought up a point, like just in terms of people writing checks and saying we're gonna write a check to deal with feeling better about ourselves, but are you really writing the check to create change, or it's just to pacify what the situation is? So
okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Let's feed into that. There you go, Molly. Go ahead.
Almost a mirror image of that, Nadia. We discussed the frustration, the sorrow, the sense of responsibility that it's been 50, 60 years since Martin Luther King. And we find ourselves with George Floyd and the current situation. And a great sense of frustration and concern for how to go forward with anti-racism, how to convene those conversations to change policy, how to deal with people who are white people who are very, very angry and dangerous. At the same time that there are people who are hurting, and empathizing with them can help bring them along.
Yeah, Molly, when you raise that, that makes me think a lot of what I've, been hearing, and I know we've all been hearing it, I think, in the news and our media around this pending doom of change because of the great white violence that's going to come out, particularly if we see the, our political shifts happening around party at the federal level. And I was thinking about that in relation to the specificity of voter suppression and what that great white violence is suggesting to us about how we should behave and keep ourselves in line around, this anti-racism work. That in some ways it's sort of saying, you are you all sure you want to do this? Because if you do this, we'll do that. And it's a type of terrorism. No, it is terrorism. And so really thinking about like what that even means, that even with a multicultural, and diverse constituency of folks who are marching in the streets and really speaking to, this demand for racial justice, for gender justice, for the intersectionality of these pieces around class, race, gender, and all the rest, that there's this terrorism around wanting to stop that. Okay. And then we had one, were there any other groups that I feel, because we had to collapse so many. Am I missing any? No, we had two groups. Tomas, yes, go ahead.
Well, Carmen and I had a lovely conversation. It was just the two of us, which I feel such a privilege about having so much time to really chew through a lot of really, really fascinating things. But it all came out of this notion that a lot of the problems we're dealing with have to do with ignorance, fear, and how then can we engage people in a conversation in which we can truly be curious about to understand how it is that those beliefs about our very nature as humans can be so different from what we think. How do we don't then catch ourselves in the very way of thinking that is at the root of this problem, like, but I'm better than you because I'm educated, I'm informed, and the difficulty behind that. We spend much time talking about how sort of the nefarious aspect of racism is that it goes unexamined, that it was sort of that we all, I told a story about a professor at Stanford who used giving a $20 bill to a student as an example of what racism is like. We immediately orient ourselves up to, okay, yeah, we know what you're doing by giving this $20 bill, and how as a society racism has that transactional component to that, and that makes it challenging. And Carmen was especially optimistic about how young people seem to be moving away from that, some of those shared beliefs that are actually challenging a lot of the problems that are in our society, and that maybe we have indeed turned a corner, because there's a shift in how, and there's a general skepticism, if not cynicism sometimes, about some of the things that we, as the older folks, do in our society. So that was an interesting sort of open question. Is that really what's going on? I don't know.
Okay. Rochelle, I'm sorry. I saw that you once I called on Tomas, then I saw that you had just unmuted or muted yourself again. So I know that the unmute is now the new nonverbal behavior to read. Would you like to chime in?
With the lean in, it's the lean in, mute, unmute. Yeah, I think our group was certainly super vulnerable, and I just want to acknowledge the beauty of this space, particularly with all African-American women, to immediately name that we were going to come in and be really vulnerable. And Valerie sort of kickstarted it, and then the rest of us was like, okay, she had the ability to be really courageous. And so I just wanted to name that the women in the group all shared from a very, very personal place. And, one of the questions, one of the prompts that I asked is, how do you experience race, and how does that experience affect your leadership? And so some of the answers around being overextended and being complicated and being frustrated and seeing race in the shadows and experience it expansively and heavy and painful are all of the things that I think we are talking about with the other groups who reported out with Nadia and Molly and Tomas around this notion of race is ever present, right? It is the ever present piece with which we deal no matter where we are, that white folks don't have to have the same way of dealing with it. And then the intersectionality for us as Black women of dealing with race, and then also feeling like we have to have our capes on so that we can, be that strong superwoman in whatever space where we are. And I really challenged the group and said, what makes us think we have to do that? And we know that that's rooted in so much of our history and so much of what happens when African-American women have to hold down both the family and the community and the. So it was interesting in the way that as leaders, we are trying to both hold that, and we have all these other pieces that we are holding. And many of us are asking ourselves, do we have to move like that anymore? And a couple of us saw the blessing in the pandemic around being able to look differently at those spaces. And I use the example of striving to get the big office, to get the big name, to get the, whatever, the name on the nameplate that said something that I had arrived. But the pandemic put us all in our homes. Right. And that office is no longer even viable. Right. And I'm not going back, right? And so the reality of, what does it mean to make those shifts so that we can be alive, A, healthy, B, both emotionally and physically healthy, so that we can continue to push against these oppressive environments. And so I just want to thank the group. Super wonderful. I got some gems that I'm going to be using. You will hear them coming out of me, but just amazing time to be with Black women.
I think that that's a really, thank you so much, Rachel, for sharing that. And I think about, how we might think about what it has meant to be inside of this experience of the pandemic and the pause on our lives. No matter who we are or where we sit, we are sitting in a space, in a place where there's been a pause for over these 8 months. And so while initially frustrated and trying to figure out what to do and how to get devices, and again, we talked about hotspots and all that stuff, and do we have to get more bandwidth at home? I know a lot of folks, as they transitioned to work from home and then settled into like, okay, we're working from home. I know in my own family, my sister had to set up a part of a space, it looks like a little school, so that her children could figure out, could have the mental shift that we're at school now. All of our homes had to sort of go through that adjustment. And so as you're 8 months in, the things that you resisted early on are there's a time, and I don't know when it happened for you. I think for me, it happened at about 6 months, if we're honest, where I said, there's some good things that could probably happen for me here. And so I wonder if, as we're closing out, and Rachel's group, it sounds like you all processed that verbally in your group, and maybe others did too. And I know that many of us have probably been processing that in our own lives. If we can begin to think up and generate up, what are some of the blessings that came from having to pause? What did we learn? What did we begin to have access to in ourselves, in our families, in our communities? What became possible because we were not moving at the same rate or pace, or that we reshifted and reshaped what our values were, what we were achieving for, or what we were being so ambitious about? What are some of the blessings in this pandemic?